Oh, all right. Hello, Timo. I think you're still on mute.
Oh yes, Marv. Yeah, okay, yeah. Yes.
Okay, okay. Hello, hello. Yeah. So I think before we really start this session, maybe some of our participants have wondered about your bio. Maybe you can explain a bit about the bio itself because
Okay.
I know that some of you asked the Yeah, I think three or four people asked the same question about the Timo's bio that we uploaded on both WhatsApp group and Instagram. Go ahead, Timo.
Well, yeah. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's always a great pleasure for me to have an opportunity to talk about my research in Indonesia. And Christina told me that I should talk today in English, but of course later on in the discussion we also can switch to Indonesian. You can also ask in Indonesian, whatever you want. Um, or in German. But yeah, and again, thanks a lot for having me. Well, yes, about my bio. Well, that's actually I'm always feel a bit puzzled when I have to say a few sentences about me, what I am actually doing, and then I thought, okay, maybe I already know what I am doing, so basically, my idea is that I don't know how to live, so I'm doing research on Indonesia and writing about it, and in doing so, my life goes by, and that's actually what I want to do. So that's like yeah, like when you're born and then you die, and in between you hopefully make your life your own and doing what you enjoy and what becomes important for you. So that's it. It doesn't mean I'm going to die anytime soon, hopefully, but yeah, the important thing is what's in between, so to speak. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, even some said that this is a very Hegelian bio. So yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, I was also inspired by Slavoj Žižek, who had a similar bio on one of his books, and I thought that's quite cool because that's a bit what he describes as subjective destitution. I mean, I don't need to go too much into detail here into theory, but it basically means that you make yourself subject to something, yeah? And by making yourself an object to something, like I don't know, doing research and or writing. It can be whatever you want. Writing poetry, being a father or a mother, whatever. But by making yourself object to something, you become properly subject. That's the idea. So yeah, that's the background. Um,
All right. Thanks, Timo, for the answer and maybe the clarification for all of you who asked about Timo's bio. Okay, I think we have full house today, and it's already 4 p.m. here, in Jakarta time, so we can start. I'll hand over the mic to Timo.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, we are quite a lot of people here. I'm impressed, and yeah, thanks again. Thank you very much for yeah, for joining, for spending time. Yeah, today, as Christina already said, I want to talk a little bit about my new book. It's entitled Indigenous Dialectics, the relationship between state and indigeneity, indigeneity as adat or masyarakat adat in Indonesia. And what I want to do today, basically four things. First, I want to briefly talk about the dialectics. What is the dialectics and why can it help us when we do research on the issue of indigeneity? Yeah, and what maybe makes an dialectical approach different from other common, I would say, more postmodern approaches or deconstructive approaches or decolonial approaches. So what are the similarities and what makes it, in my view, at least a bit unique? And second, and that's like a 10 minutes or so theoretical introduction. I hope I can do it in less than 10 minutes. Then I want to talk a little bit about indigeneity as adat and the state of Indonesia from the colonial era when the notion of adat was introduced by the Dutch and conceptualized by the Dutch until today post-Reformasi Indonesia, where indigenous activists challenge and I would also say simultaneously reproduce statehood. So my argument here in the second part is basically adat has both a constitutive and a contrasting or conflicting relation with the state, a relation shaped by economic and political processes. And adat is, therefore, to put it dialectically, self-difference of the state. And then that sounds a little bit like a technical jargon here, self-difference of the state, but I hope it becomes more clear when we talk about the concrete example later. Indigeneity as the self-difference of state as a social totality. So it comes into being against, but also through the state, and vice versa. The state also become into existence against and through what can be termed adat in Indonesia. And then in the third part, I will talk a little bit about the case study on the processes of recognition of indigenous communities in what I call the Duri Highlands. So that's basically an area in South Sulawesi, south of Toraja, where I did some of my field work. And here I want to make the argument that indigeneity is part of a, what can say, long durée struggle for egalitarianism, for more egalitarian society. This is, of course, not a linear process, and I think we only can really know about it when it's already done. Yeah. So indigeneity I analyze here as I would say a social position within a historical constellation, and the recognition of indigeneity today is an outcome of different social struggles. Yeah? And even yeah. That's what I want to talk about in that part. And then the fourth part and the last part, I want again talk a little bit about theory, about what is critical indigeneity. And there I want to make the argument that instead of conceptualizing indigeneity as one could say maybe a decolonial option that is located beyond coloniality, modernity, as for instance suggested in decolonial approaches, as something that exists on its own and is like a radical difference to coloniality, modernity. Indigenous politics, I argue, can be emancipatory precisely when they accept the basic modern assumption of modernity and the Indonesian nation as a constitutive part of the nation that once committed itself to overcome tradition and inequality. Indigenous activists now emphasize the role of tradition in holding on to this promise of Indonesian struggle for independence and a new society. But of course, whereas in former times, the struggle in Indonesia for independence and modernization was against tradition and against adat, today, this thrust of a more egalitarian society is appropriated through the notion of indigeneity, adat, and tradition. So my argument here is indigeneity is emancipatory or progressive when it becomes a particular, for instance, the indigenous as the marginalized, when it claims to speak for the universal, for the whole, for instance, for the Indonesian nation. So I can imagine that sounds a bit abstract, but hopefully it will make sense soon. I also will show a few pictures for those of you who have never been to the Duri area and Reka in South Sulawesi in the third part. But before that, let me say a little bit about the dialectics first and about indigeneity in Indonesia in general. So, what is the dialectics and why can it help us when we, as social scientists, or especially as people who do research on indigeneity? So, I would say dialectics can be maybe you first some notions like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but I would ask you to forget for a moment about it and to imagine the dialectics as unity in contradiction or difference in totality. Yeah? So that basically, whenever you have two supposedly opposites and you think about how they are interrelated and mutually constitutive, you already apply a dialectical approach. And for the notion of indigeneity, let me start with what Jonas Benz in his book called Indigenous Paradox. Uh, because there we already have this idea of indigeneity as a constitutively um, um, contradictive identity, like all identities, let's say. So, what is an indigenous paradox? Jonas Benz basically did research in the Americas and and on indigenous recognition in the Americas. So, and he came up with the idea that indigeneity comes into being only through its paradoxical relation with the state. So, indigenous people must claim sovereignty and, in the most extreme form, a position outside the very state that they want to acknowledge their rights. In other words, they reject state sovereignty, but simultaneously require it for their rights. Yeah, they make claims, right claims to the state by saying we are not part of it. So this is a paradoxical situation. And what I suggest now is to extend this to an dialectical idea. Indigeneity is, just as nations or states, yeah, not simply there, it comes into existence against and through its others, which can be the state, but it also can be colonialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, and so on. Whatever it opposes is already a constitutive um, a constitutive moment for indigeneity and vice versa. Again, also the nation state and colonialism or whatever comes into existence through its other, like social positions deemed as indigenous. Why indigeneity, while indigeneity constantly depends then on its other, indigeneity also negates it. Yeah? This is a dialectical idea. It negates the other, capitalism, nation state, colonialism. Yeah? It negates it, but depends on it as a social position. It is when it becomes political subjectivity, the contradiction of a social order, yeah, or social totality as a society itself. When I talk here about totality, I mean this in contrast, I'd say, to more fancy approaches, which suggest talking about assemblages or singularities rather than about society. And I talk about society here as a social totality, which is, and this is crucial, constitutively contradictive. And it is these contradictions that make possible political subjectivity in the first place. So political subjectivity emerges at these cracks, yeah, in the social order, like in the state, yeah, where you have the idea of a harmonious society, and then there are, for instance, economic contradictions. That's where political subjectivity can emerge. And indigeneity or adat, as any political subjectivity, is then the inner contradiction, the gap of such a society or social totality. So this is why indigeneity is constitutively, I would say, paradoxical. And it's precisely this paradoxical constellation where it has this progressive potential. I would not say that indigeneity is something you just claim to be there and there's ancient wisdom and your wise ancestor, whatever. No, it's precisely where you enter modernity and where you inhabit, so to speak, the cracks of modernity and the gaps of modernity at the state. And and its promises, which are of course not fulfilled. So I would say, inspired by standpoint theory, for instance, indigenous studies often conceptualize indigeneity and indigenous knowledge as radically different from Western knowledge. Maybe you've heard about that. So, in contrast, the critique that dialectical approach, I would say, suggests, and which I want to outline today, conceptualizes indigeneity as relative different, that is, as always already embedded into the opposite, state, colonialism, neoliberalism, that it criticizes. It is based on the assumption that indigeneity has no absolute autonomy from what is conceptualized or thought of as its other, like state, capitalism, modernity, whatever. And thus, the aim of a dialectical critique of indigeneity is not to provide a space in which indigeneity can assert itself, but rather to understand and criticize the very mechanisms, the very forms and processes from which indigeneity as a social position can emerge. So what is dialectics here? Dialectic means basically a method of inquiry where seemingly binary oppositions, indigeneity, the state, indigeneity, modernity, indigeneity, capitalism, and what and so on, where these seemingly binary oppositions are brought into dialogue with each other, and where the co-constitutive features of these oppositions are analyzed. Yeah. So, but let's give some concrete examples here. I'm already talking too long about theory. So, indigeneity as adat and the state in Indonesia. So, during the late colonial era, um, there were a dispute in the Netherlands on what law or what forms of law and legal regimes should apply to the Dutch East Indies. So, of course, I'm aware that it's always a bit problematic to start an inquiry with the colonial era, as if there would have been nothing before. But in this point, I think it makes sense because that was when adat as an as law was actually conceptualized, and we can still see that today. And even when I talk later about South Sulawesi, where it's about the recognition of masyarakat hukum adat, yeah, of indigenous law communities. And why is law important here? So the question was, should there be a universal law in the Dutch East Indies for all people, for Europeans, Indonesians, other Asians, or should there be a legal pluralism? So, whereas some academicians from Utrecht argued in favor for a universal law, say, yeah, we are all human beings, we should be subject to a universal law regime. There was the Leiden School and Van Vollenhoven who argued that adat was the original legal feature of these societies, and that there should be a legal pluralism. So European law for Dutch and European people, and adat law for indigenous people, for the autochthon population. So Van Vollenhoven argued that the East Indies are a legal realm of adat law and for a recognition of that otherness. This, of course, sounds in a sense good because it's a recognition of the other, of the non-European. But the crucial point here is that this idea of otherness, of recognizing the other, was always already incorporated into a colonial totality and in the economic political contradictions of colonial capitalism. So, to put it more abstract, colonial capitalism needed its other, the social economic otherness of adat. Yeah. So Tanya Lee had famously made the argument, and I think, and I strongly agree here, that adat was the other who stabilized actually the colonial economy. Yeah, it was a place outside the legal realm of colonialism, but its function was to stabilize the colonial economy because, why is that? A system of unified law would have had devastating economic effects and would trigger social unrest. So the idea is that if all people in the Dutch East Indies would be subject of a common law, then they would also probably sell their land, and that would drive processes of poverty and then also probably social unrest. So that's why colonial capitalism, as every form of capitalism, is in a sense in a need of its outside, yeah, to stabilize the very order. So, and then there's of course this discussion in academia whether Adat is a colonial invention or whether Adat is an authentic cultural otherness. And I would say neither nor or both. I mean, in a sense, you could say Adat was codified with social within the social totality in society of colonial politics and economy. So the idea of general legal features in an area from Aceh to Papua, yeah. And as such, it expressed contradictions constitutive to the colonial project, indirect rule and the acknowledgement of otherness on the one hand, versus its economic and social domination. So the political consequences, simultaneous recognition and subordination of Adat. Adat as an umbrella term for local customs and laws here. So this Adat was part of the state, the colonial state, as well as its other. Of course, you could argue, obviously, that local customs and or laws, or however you want to call it, Adat, existed before the Dutch came, and in this way, Adat is not an invention of the Dutch. However, Adat as an abstraction, as an umbrella term for customary law and customs in a defined area, only came into existence through the colonial project, of which the Leiden School and von Vollenhoven were, of course, an integral part. Yeah? Adat as an abstraction, I would say, transcended local context and became a term of importance for colonial governance. Adat became, in other words, the self-difference of the colonial state. And it has thus maintained this role of the state's self-difference after independence in various ways. So, for instance, in independence Indonesia, they would say there was a new basic contradiction in society or in social totality. On the one hand, there was a seek for a new society, yeah, to build a new society, versus, on the other hand, a return to non-Western, politically authentic Indonesian roots. So there were progressives which said that domestic feudalism, including Adat and tradition, was always part and parcel of colonialism. So colonialism was not just simply a 350 years old project carried out from the Dutch, but together with the domestic feudal elite. And both must be overcome. So the task of building Indonesia is the task of building a new society from scratch. Because both Adat and colonialism must be overcome. Traditionalists, on the other hand, argued that Adat is generally an Indonesian, and when we want to build a new country, a new nation, new society, we have to rely on this tradition. Yeah? This was often backed by organicist, anti-Enlightenment thoughts from Europe, but also Japanese fascism and Japanese aristocratic thoughts. So, like in thinking of Supomo and other organicists, early thinkers in Indonesia. So, and Sukarno, for instance, I would say, were in between both. And in practice, that meant Adat was partially acknowledged as the basic law, for instance, for land tenure. I don't go on into the details here, since we don't have time, I'm afraid, for that. But Adat was acknowledged as the basic law for instance, land tenure, but could always be overturned by what was called the national interests. Yeah? And during the so-called New Order under Suharto, this became even more apparent. Yeah, so it has a capitalist outlook and aimed attracting capital from other countries for its developmental state. Yeah, for this pembangunan ideology. And in this course, Adat, and even though this in terms of political theory, the New Order, Sukarno, very much emphasized traditions and yeah, a supposedly harmonious Indonesian society modeled as a harmonious Javanese village and so on. Yeah, it's completely sidelined the idea of Adat. And here, and actually argued in the stipulation that land not in constant use was classified as state land. So there's no other rights for land when it's not in constant use, which is actually a legacy of a colonial law from 1870, even long before the Leiden School intervened, that said that land not in constant use in gedurig gebruik is state land, and then the government could lend it to companies, for instance, for plantations. So especially from the 1980s onwards, there there happened many land conflicts because of that. So the new basic contradiction, I would say, was between development and conservative nationalism on the other hand, versus the emerging dispossessions of land, which you can even describe in Marxist terms as original accumulation. This is the process of separating the producer from its means of production, land. So local political movements appeared. And because there was a lack of leftist political identities after 65, 66, environmental activists proposed indigeneity as a political category then in the early 1990s. Now, the notion from transnational discourses had to be translated then, however, into the Indonesian context. So in 1993, in a meeting of environmental activists in Tanah Toraja in South Sulawesi, they decided for choosing Adat as the Indonesian expression for indigeneity, yeah, as masyarakat, as indigenous peoples. And during that time and in the following years, indigenous movement appeared in Indonesia, especially during the Reformasi era. So in 1998, Aman, the Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, had famously his first meeting in Jakarta and claimed, if the state does not recognize us, indigenous communities, we don't recognize the state. So here in this non-recognition does, however, in fact express and constitutes the relational character of indigeneity and the state. Yeah? So recognition is mutual. Yeah? And as such, indigeneity always already depends on the state, even it appears as independent. So Aman is now the biggest national indigenous organization in the world. And what is important here, uh, in contrast to other countries, it recognizes indigenous communities, not ethnic groups, yeah? And focuses on indigenous land rights. And especially since 2014, when Aman supported Jokowi, new forms of institutional activism emerged, and the relation between the indigenous movement and the state became closer. So yeah, while it's, as I just said, was initially marked by rejection of the state, yeah, it becomes more and more alike. So more engagement, less confrontation. Since Jokowi and the Jokowi administration promised recognition, which was then, however, in practice, very slow and disappointing. So, but what is now masyarakat adat for the indigenous movement? So when I talked to Ruka Sombolingi, the chairwoman of Aman, she always emphasized, and I think this is quite crucial, that masyarakat adat are those who have always lost in history. Yeah, they were colonized by the Dutch, but also by rajas and sultans, also by the new order. Yeah, but however, they are part of the Indonesian nation. Don't claim sovereignty or state sovereignty outside the Indonesian nation. So therefore, Adat movement is Indonesia, or is Indonesian, as it holds on to the idea of a nation of the marginalized or exploited, but also takes a stance against the nation, yeah? Against, for instance, the New Order regime, or against the state as an agent of land disposition. So, and when in 2012, the Constitutional Court decided in favor of Amman that indigenous forests are not state forests, there had to be a process of recognition because one state had to determine what are actually indigenous communities. And for that, Amman demanded and still demand Undang-Undang Masyarakat Adat, a law on indigenous peoples, that recognizes communities directly by the national government, but the fact is now that regencies, so Kabupaten, must recognize indigenous communities, and only then these communities can apply at the forestry ministry for land titles. So the idea behind it, the rationale is, from a state perspective, there must be no conflicts on the local level, and then the local legislation can recognize indigenous communities, and only then they can get their land rights. So this, of course, requires political engagement on a regency level. And now let me talk a little bit about my research in South Sulawesi. Maybe I can show you some photos. Let me share my presentation. One moment, please. Can you see it? I think you can.
Yes, we can see it.
Good, okay. What I was talking about. Okay, I want to say Adaka. Um, so this is where I did my research, and it was a long time ago, short before the COVID pandemic in 2019. I was in South Sulawesi, and especially here in this area where the Duri live, the ethnic group of the Duri in the regency of Enrekang. Enrekang is a place in between the lowlands of South Sulawesi, dominated by the Makassar and the Bugis group, and the upland. And in this land in between, there are different ethnic groups like Duri, Enrekang, or Maiwa, who already before colonialism joined a federation of kingdoms in this area named Masam Rampulo, or at the edge of the mountains, because it was this in between lowland and highlands. So maybe a little bit of background information here. This could be described as a marginal part of Indonesia and also of Sulawesi. where you have this Bugis civilization in the south and this marginalized group in the uplands. And the Bugis and Makassaris have a long history of lowland kingdoms, whereas the areas in the highland were often in history areas that were exploited by these lowland kingdoms. Even though there were political alliances between, let's say, Duri, Toraja, and the upland and the lowland kingdoms, the areas in the upland were often areas for slave rights, which were very important for the economy at that time, especially in the 19th century. So where you had basically two main commodities there, coffee and slave. And there were coffee and slave wars over these. Um, um, the slave trade was officially banned then, I have to check, in 1860 by the Dutch, but in this case here continued to exist until 1906 because this was also an area of indirect rule. And the Dutch only established direct control in this area in 1906 and then abolished the slave trade. But besides that, incorporated traditional hierarchies into the colonial order. So whereas you initially had this distinction of slaves, commoners, nobles, then you had this distinction of common people and nobles, and at the top the Dutch. And this, of course, continued only until 1942, when the Japanese occupation introduced a new class system, namely the abolishment of all classes, so a quasi-enslavement of the whole population by the Japanese. So the idea is that Japanese soldiers and the others, and it didn't matter if they were former slaves, common people, or nobles, were forced to work for the Dutch. And social hierarchies were eliminated for these 3 days. So basically a quasi-enslavement of all. And that, I would say, introduced the idea that social hierarchies can be abolished. So what appeared as written in stone, crumbled overnight. So the local population in this area, which are, by the way, of Muslim faith, whereas the Toraja are Christians, the Duri and Rekang, Maiwa, and of course also Bugis and Makassaris are Muslims. And in the 1950s, this idea of an egalitarian society, but not as quasi-slaves of the Japanese, but as a society where the common people rule, where local people rule, emerged again, and in this case here, in the form of political Islam, as in the Darul Islam movement, which was, some described it basically as an Islamic kind of socialism, which, however, also meant the oppression and annihilation of traditional animist beliefs, but also as well as of traditional hierarchies. In the Duri area, the Darul Islam movement was strongly supported by local communities, whereas the Indonesian troops, the Indonesian army, was perceived as a Javanese army, and again as another foreign force. So this time, from the mid-50s to the early and mid-60s, was characterized by war, starvation, violence, but also by a land reform and a new form of social equality. I mean, as long as you were Muslim, then you became equal. It doesn't matter if you have been your ancestors or you have been a slave or a nobleman, and also the nobility was forced to give away gold and precious belongings. So people became basically economically equal. So the crucial point here is, and why is the Darul Islam movement important when we talk about indigeneity today? Darul Islam was, of course, very much, in a sense, anti-Adat, yeah, because it was against the traditional hierarchies and pro-egalitarianism. So, and the weakening and even the abolishment of Adat institutions by Darul Islam today becomes an obstacle for the recognition of indigenous communities, as it is often very difficult to prove that indigenous institutions still exists. However, by weakening the other hierarchies and institutions, Darul Islam cut also the ties between official politics and traditional elites. And today, politics does not rely on Adat and traditional hierarchies, as it, for instance, does in nearby Toraja. And also, this abolishment of tradition, abolishment of Adat, made possible a new conceptualization of Masyarakat Adat as rather egalitarian communities, yeah? Which better fits into the Aman image of Masyarakat Adat as egalitarian communities. So what happened is, in other words, the anti-Adat stance of Darul Islam facilitated, after decades, the emergence of indigeneity as egalitarian communities. Yeah. So basically, a long-term cunning of reason here. So yeah, but then what happened after Darul Islam and during the new order? This area was incorporated into the Indonesian state, into the Indonesian developmental state, and also new economy emerged since new food crops were brought, like cabbage, onions, tomatoes, and the forest, the Adat forest was now state owned, but only controlled sporadically. So indigenous communities there, like here in Orang, Marina, and Uru, where I have been, for instance, for my research, people used the Adat forest, even though they were not supposed to. But this was, they even planted trees and coffee inside the forest, which was, however, technically state forest. And then in post-Suharto, there was a new emphasis of local development strategies, as well as a revitalization of religion, which had always been strong, but now even more a strong emphasis on textual modernist interpretations became important. So Aman activists enter local development discourses and the strategy of institutional activism since about 2012 emerged, when Hutan Adat, or indigenous forest, should be not should hand it over to indigenous communities. And so there were several challenges, however. One challenge in Rekang, since the Regency of Rekang had to acknowledge now indigenous communities so that they then could apply for land titles in Jakarta. However, for doing that, they needed a local law, Peraturan Daerah, or a Perda, on the acknowledgement of indigenous people. And that was, at the beginning, quite difficult because indigeneity, or Adat recognition, was seen as an attempt to revitalize animism or kepercayaan. So the idea was, in Rekang, the original former religion, Aluk Tujolo, of the Duri, for instance, which contained a lot of ancestors and spirit worship, was perceived as a shirk, as a superstition, and not in line with proper Islam. So many people in America opposed the idea of indigenous recognition. But since Aman had many ties to local parties, especially to the PAN party, Um, they engaged in negotiations and finally pursued the other political parties that such a recognition of indigenous communities is not an attempt to revitalize indigenous religion, but an attempt to strengthen the local community, the local economy. Because when indigenous people, the idea is the argument, of course, when they own land, they can make better use of it. So then in there's also this mural in Enrekang depicting the struggle against the Dutch or the Japanese. What I want to show you is here. That's how it looks in this area, the highland area. Um, so Enrekang was actually the second regency in South Sulawesi and the first who had a perda on indigenous communities, which had a criteria approach and a definition, let's say a checklist of what an indigenous community is. Yeah. So they did not directly recognize indigenous communities, but the PERDA was like a checklist of what has to be fulfilled, and then there's a process of recognition. Maybe I can give you a little insight. So on the PERDA side, in order to be recognized, a community must fulfill the criteria of being, quote, still recognizable as a community, masih dalam bentuk pengguyuban, yeah. It has to have clearly defined customary law and territory, wilayah hukum adat yang jelas, political adat institutions, ya, kelembagaan adat, and the community must still obey a customary law, ya, hukum adat yang masih ditaati. If these criteria are verified by a committee, then this document is then required if they apply for land titles. And that's to say what indigenous communities are. Masyarakat hukum adat contributes to the cultural values of Indonesian nation. Yeah. Moreover, it reads that masyarakat hukum adat are Indonesian citizens, warga negara Indonesia, which have special cultural characteristics, memiliki karakteristik khas, also live in harmony according to their customs and hold ties to their origin, yeah? And maintain a strong relation to the land and the natural environment, hubungan yang kuat dengan tanah dan lingkungan hidup, and has a special system of norms of their economic, social, political, cultural, and legal matters. Yeah? So while there is no dichotomy between masyarakat hukum adat and the state, as members of these communities are defined as Indonesian citizens, difference is always evoked here through this idea of cultural difference and special relation to the land, whatever that means in concrete. And so this PERDA was passed in 2016, and today there are 10 indigenous communities that have that are recognized by the Regency of Enrekang, and 7 of them already have their customary land titles. So, and this is also very important for the idea of institutional activism. And what's interesting here is that this process of indigenous recognition is also an economic process. So what they established were BUMA, Badan Usaha Masyarakat Milik Masyarakat Adat, as well as indigenous women enterprises. And what's key here is that within BUMA and the indigenous communities, now there's a fairly new idea of common ownership of a means of production, not only land, but also machines like coffee roasting machines, which had actually previously um, not been there. And like in many parts of Indonesia, communal ownership of means of production beyond the family was very uncommon. But now, through the idea of being part of an indigenous community, people not only got introduced to the idea of communal land um, ownership, but perceive it as inherently indigenous and traditional. Um, so what you have here is, on the one hand, I would say there's an incorporation into capitalist economies and production networks. So indigenous then they plant coffee or other crops and sell them on the market in a capitalist economy and framework. And also the very idea of indigenous communities as entrepreneurs and as communities who contribute to the development and to local capitalism, that is, was important for the very process of recognition. However, in this process, on the other hand, new forms of egalitarian local economies and economic organization could emerge. So the decision making and distribution of profits can become now more egalitarian, at least according to Amman. Because what Amman recognizes as indigenous communities are not sultanates or petty kingdoms, but rather egalitarian communities. Um, important, yeah. So I would say by merging, firstly, Indonesian discourses on gotong royong and mutual help and kerjasama. Second, international discourses on indigeneity as marginalized egalitarian community. And third, local histories of uh, non-fatalism and Duile community as marginalized social units. And indigeneity there is co-reproduced with the local state and its economy. So there is no outside of the state or state economy, but indigeneity is basically a product of the state and its economy, as well as its contradictions. So now let me say a few words now, maybe um, about what this means then for study of indigeneity. 10 minutes or so, and we can start to discuss. So, indigeneity and its critique. I would argue now here for indigeneity as Indonesians' social symptom that is particular, that stands in for a universal. That sounds more complicated than it actually is. What I mean here is indigeneity is always then a progressive force when it emerges as not only as a particularity that asserts itself against the other, but as part of a new universality. It is on the one hand a rejection of a universality, namely the Indonesian state and its capitalism. Remember, Aman famously stated in 1998 that if the state does not recognize us, indigenous peoples, we do not recognize the state, but it's also part of the state. Yeah? It's part of the state as in capitalist state discourses and in what Tanya Lee has called the will to improve. But also a reminder of what the Indonesian state and the Indonesian nation once promised to be. Yeah? Namely a social project born from the struggle against colonialism and traditional hierarchies. Basically, an egalitarian project for a new egalitarian society, which was then, of course, abandoned, especially during the New Order, but that's originally in Indonesian thrust. an attempt to build society anew and to overcome expectations and hierarchies. And this idea, I would say, lives on, for instance, in Aman's aim to represent indigenous communities as people who, as Ruka, the chairwoman of Aman, put it, who have always lost in history, who were always marginalized, yeah, by Dutch colonialism, by domestic kingdoms, by the New Order state, uh, um, um, or by a neoliberalism. And it is this social position now, as marginalized community, that stands in for the universal promise of liberation and egalitarianism. Adat, and that's the beautifully contradictive part here, Adat, that once deemed an obstacle for a just and egalitarian society, during the Indonesian Revolution, for instance, is now resignified as a particular that aims at equality as a new social value. Then please remember that it didn't used to be like that in times of the Indonesian Revolution. That's as an example. Take, for instance, the translation of the Internationale by Ki Haja Dewantara, yeah? Where they say, lenyapkan adat dan paham tua. Kita rakyat sadar-sadar, dunia sudah berganti rupa untuk kemenangan kita. Ya. So, to abolish adat dan paham tua, so adat basically is paham tua. Yeah. Adat means the old world, or in other translation of the Internationale, dunia lama. And as such, it meant hierarchies and tradition against the struggle for equality. However, today, adat is constant and re-signified. We know that in other places in Indonesia, the revival of adat often have facilitated traditional elites to become dominant in local politics and to secure their superior social position. But that's, of course, not what Aman wants. Yeah? Aman is very keen on this idea of social equality. So today, that is consistent and precisely by, I would say, playing along with state discourses, with what Tanya Lee has called the will to improve. Yeah, and with states and institutions, Adat can introduce cracks, I would say, in the foundation of these very discourses and practices and institution it relies on. Taking the promises of the existing order, promises of a just and equal society seriously, can be often more radical than simply position oneself outside and rejecting the state and modernity. In the Duile Highlands, yeah, seemingly harmless efforts can open up new possibilities for collective land ownership and, for instance, a women's participation in economic processes. Yeah, they are part, I would argue, of a long-term process in which society moves towards egalitarianism. This is, however, not a predetermined process, and it can only be properly understood retrospectively. For critical researcher or activists, I would argue, it means to understand Adat and indigeneity as historical formations embedded into a social totality that is constitutively contradictive. And through these contradictions, ideas like Adat emerges as they address these contradictions. For instance, dispossession of land and so on. And indigeneity is, at best, an expression of these social contradictions. But it is also an ideology that relies on symbolic political solutions for problems deriving from political economy. Yeah? So you have you have economic problems, but you address them through the language of tradition and indigeneity, yeah, or say through a language and concepts of culture. when you deal with economy. So that means when criticizing indigeneity as an ideology, I would say it's the task of critical scholars, also activists, to sublate, that is simultaneously to preserve and to transcend the critique that the ideology of indigeneity offers for economic dispossession, state control, and capitalist incorporation. Or in other words, indigeneity is a particular social position emerging in and through the structural contradictions of society and modernity as such. Yeah? It is not the absolute outside of this, but it is the effect of its structural conditions. And therefore, indigeneity is both an expression of these conditions and of modernity and the state, as well as its critique. So, thank you very much. I think I already talked 1 hour here now, so I don't want to talk more because yeah, I think we should have time to discuss about indigeneity or about Indonesian history or whatever you want. First of all, thanks very much for your patience and for your attention. And yeah, please.
Thank you so much, Timo. I think we did learn a lot from your presentation, especially about the, indigeneity as the indigeneity as dialectics. That means that it's not um it's a identity that relies on the state for its existence, when it passes through and against the notion of state itself. All right, I think there are many questions already. Okay, so I will read the first question on the chat. So I will read the questions on the chat first, and if any of you wants to ask directly to Timo, please raise your hand. It's question from Alfred Peck. Is the embrace of customary law context applicable to the British Malaya during the same period, or are the Dutch colonialists the only ones that embraced across Nusantara?
I'm not an expert on Malaysia, but what I can say is that Malaysia also, just as the Dutch, relied a lot, or the British relied often on this concept of indirect rule. As you say, okay, you have your cultural values, your tradition, your laws, your whatever language, and let's keep it as long as you're part of the colonial system. So I would say also in British Malaya, with this process of, I mean, sometimes people imagine, especially in Germany, co colonialism as an attempt of direct force. And of course, sometimes it was, and sometimes it was not only a direct force, but also mass killing and mass murders and so on. But it also needed often this formal, at least, acknowledgement of the other to be able to exist. Yeah. So in British Malaya, then you also have this idea of what was called by vulnerable plural societies. Yeah, also in Dutch East Indies. So the idea is you have one political unit in the colonial state, and then you have different segments of society. Yeah, like I don't know in British Malaya, Malays, in different sultanates, and the Indian people, the Chinese, and Dayak people in Sarawak and Orang Asli, I don't know, which have all their distinct law, yeah. And this is actually what I find so dangerous today when people argue for this radical difference of distinct social groups, like in liberal multiculturalism, because isn't liberal multiculturalism not, in a sense, very similar to this colonial idea of the plural society? Yeah, and wouldn't be much more emancipatory if we talk about universality and what makes a society and for what common goal we want to aim, yeah? And because you see, in Indonesia could only come into existence through the idea that there is a common goal, yeah, that we have to overcome this differences between different local communities. And in Malaysia, you see until today, Malaysia is, I would say, much less unified in social terms. It's much it's still much more plural society as you have yeah this distinct groups. So I would say it's also applicable to the Malaysian context.
All right, Timo. So Alfred, I hope it answered your question, but if you have another follow-up question, feel free to ask another more. We have another question from Chata. This case reminds me of Toraja's Adat revival. In their case, Adat with state support stabilized the nobility hegemony in Toraja society. Has your research encountered these cases of Adat becoming a way to reassert inequality through local Adat politics? Becomes in the end, like in other countries, it matters greatly who is speaking as quote unquote elder or representative of Adat and who is included in that Adat culture and who's excluded. Thank you, Timo.
Thing because of course Toraja is was very nearby, and I visited often Toraja and talked to Torajas uh, um, in the Aman movement. And in Toraja, what's so interesting is that there's this I would say even fight over Adat. Yeah, it's not a it's a fight because in Toraja, even before Aman was active there, traditional nobility already claimed the idea of Adat and strengthen their social position. Yeah, for instance, by introducing so-called Lembang system, yeah, a traditional indigenous system of government, or that's what they claim, a traditional indigenous system of governance, where, of course, you only can elect basically or only people from a certain social class and nobility can be elected. Yeah? And against this, Aman argues that no, this is not the kind of Adat and indigeneity we want. We have an egalitarian idea of Adat communities, yeah, where people should participate equally, yeah, as indigenous as members of the indigenous communities. So, but this is still difficult in Toraja, and then you see that in Toraja, in the formal politics, the people who are claiming Adat are often older men, whereas women which in Adat are in Aman and are engaged in the in this idea of indigeneity as more equal society. In Rekang, by contrast, because you had this Darul Islam movement, this traditional structures that was I meant with the ties between Adat and official politic were more or less erased, yeah, because they said that Darul Islam said we don't need this idea of people who are in a higher social position because of tradition. As long as you're Muslim, you are equal. So, and this, therefore, it wasn't possible in Rekang to establish such system, such state system based on tradition and adat, like in Toraja. Yeah? And you know what? I remember when I talked to Ruka and about what is the relationship between tradition and indigeneity. And he told me this example. When she was young, she used to play a drum, which she, as a woman, was not you not were not allowed to do it. But because she was from a family from nobility, that was even it was not allowed, but people also didn't interact and and her father let her do it. So she changed this a bit. So or she challenged this tradition, which she was only able to because she was member of a noble class, right? And for her, this is the idea of that or indigeneity. It's not that you should just reproduce the social order with all its inequalities, but to challenge it. Yeah. So said, yeah, as indigenous people, we shape our adat and tradition. As indigenous people, we decide what adat is. It's not simply tradition we repeat and repeat and repeat. Yeah? But we think about it and make it anew. Tradition itself is subject to change.
Thanks, Timo. Chata, if you have any follow-up questions, go ahead to ask Timo. I will continue to read another question from the chat, and after that, I will let participants if you wanna ask direct questions. It's from Dylan Basri. You previously referred to South American case studies in which forms of sovereignty were granted to indigenous communities. That arrangement appears somewhat contextually coherent in settler colonial settings. However, the Indonesian context is structurally different, as it is not a settler state in the same sense. So, considering your cumulative theoretical and empirical knowledge so far in this field, what configurations of sovereignty, aside from recommendation from Aman that you mentioned as well, would be normatively defensible and politically viable for empowering indigeneity as a conceptual and strategic axis of struggle in Indonesia more broadly? Also, I would like to know your input on how central is the category of settler colonialism to this discussion, given that its use might be productive to assign unique status to indigenous struggle in Indonesia that is different from their counterpart in the Americas, Oceania, and African continents. And the last one would also love to know your recommendations for further readings in this regard of any.
Well, yes, that's right. Of course, there's a big difference between previous settler colonies and colonies where, like Indonesia, you have this ideas of indirect rule more often applied. And Um, in when you do research, for instance, in the US or Canada or in Australia, indigeneity is or can or more often appears what Jonas Benz terms the indigenous paradox. Yeah, you make sovereignty claims against the state, so you need state sovereignty to make claims that you're not part of state sovereignty. Yeah, that's the indigenous paradox in settler colonial setting. Well, yeah, and in Indonesia, it's or in many countries in Asia and Africa, indigeneity works a bit different since you must distinguish indigeneity from other um, indig let's say autochthone populations. That's also why, of course, Suharto often rejected the idea of indigeneity as applicable to Indonesia because they know we are all indigenous, yeah, because we are all Indonesians. And therefore, the idea of indigeneity works as, yeah, you are marginalized, yeah, you're somehow culturally and often also economically marginalized, for instance, through the idea of uh, adat, because you rely on it. And that's why this idea of taking adat as the translation of indigeneity was so genius, because then, for instance, activists could at the same time say, we are part of the state, yeah, we are adat, we are that what has always been here, what is generally Indonesian. On the other hand, it distinguishes themselves from mainstream society, yeah, from modern mainstream society, which is not subject of traditional law. So And then, of course, you have different concepts of sovereignty. Yeah? So Amman has also this idea of of kedaulatan, yeah, of sovereignty, but it's not a sovereignty against the state. It's a sovereignty that the indigenous communities should be in charge of internal issues, like, for instance, land tenure, yeah, as a communal project. Yeah? That's the focus. Of course, for arguing that, there also need this other idea of customary law. For example, in the Duile communities where I did my research, they even have traditional, or claim to have traditional law like a death penalty for people who, and this is obviously something they got from the Darul Islam movement, that people who committed adultery or whatever can be killed. Of course, this law is not in force, but when they're applied for the status of an indigenous community, they had to came up with other laws, yeah, with specific legal regulation, even though they are not in force. And interestingly, this regulation sometimes comes from a period which was entirely anti-tradition. Yeah? So then but in terms of sovereignty, that means you must, as an indigenous community, perform sovereignty by claiming that you have indigenous laws and indigenous regulations, even though they are sometimes not in line with state law. Yeah, in this case, obviously, if you would kill someone because of an indigenous law, then you also would be subject of state uh, punishment regimes. Yeah, but in when the but in the process of recognition of indigenous communities, nobody bothered, because this was, I think, it was a mere performative act to state that there is this sovereignty as such idea, which is, however, not enforced. So, yeah. Another question, sovereignty. A good understand is the settler colonialism. Yeah, the idea of indigeneity was originally, of course, introduced in countries like Canada, Australia, the US, um, and as I said, when this idea moves to other contexts like Indonesia or other contexts where not in a settler colonial context, then you always have to translate this notion, the idea of indigeneity. And in this case, it was, as I said, adat. So yeah, it's of course a different concept, but what is always, I think, what is an benchmark of indigeneity, both in formerly settler colonial contexts and in contexts like Indonesia, is that you have to have this idea of a marginalized community, which has some special relations to the land or to. So you need some kind, you need an idea of a continuous history, yeah, and marginalization in cultural or economic sense. And further readings on Adat. Well, there are some interesting edited volumes, like the edited volumes already from 2007 by Henley and Davidson on indigenous peoples in Indonesia. And I think a few years ago there was a very interesting special issue, I think, in the Asian Pacific Journal of Anthropology, um, with some really nice, interesting contributions. That would be, I think, a recommendation for further readings.
Thank you, Timo, for answering the questions. So before I read the questions from the chat, please, if anyone want to ask Timo directly, open your mic, raise your hands. Okay, Indah, please. Okay. Anyone wants to ask Timo directly? Okay. If not yet, I will continue to read another question from the chat. It's from Ucu Martanto. Thank you, Timo, for excellent and solid explanation of indigenous peoples in Indonesia. I was wondering if you could share with us whether the Duri peoples in the pre-colonial era were considered quote-unquote indigenous, for example, by the kingdoms that ruled their land. Do the Duri people have a concept of indigeneity, and how do they define their indigeneity?
I would say they didn't use the idea of indigeneity then, even though in a sense they were marginal, and also had an idea of what that means. So um, in the time, in the era of the lowland kingdoms of Bugis and Makassar kingdoms, in what is today the Regency of Enrekang, there were several petty kingdoms of Duri, Enrekang, and Maira ethnic groups. And what they did was basically to form a federation in order to get a better position in bargaining with the lowland kingdoms and the Torajas in the north. So the idea was, yes, we are marginal, we live somewhere on the edge, yeah? But indigeneity then means, yeah, you have a special relation to the land when you are occupied by a different force. And in that time, the Duri were not occupied, even though there were always this intruding slave rights. So basically, they had local autonomy, but there were sometimes victims of slave rights, as well as people who participated in the slave rights, because you were only suitable as a potential slave at the time when you were not a Muslim. Yeah, so for the Muslim population in the south, they needed slaves from the uplands, non-Muslims. And the Duri at the time had a unique, a special relation. So formally, there were Muslims, especially the kings, but in some remote areas, there were still adherents of the traditional beliefs. They were quite similar to the indigenous Toraja religion with ancestor worshipping and so on. And they also had now this caves in rocks where they put their dead relatives, just like the Toraja. So that means that Duri, as Muslims, could participate in slave rights, and Duri, as non-Muslims, could also be victims. Yeah? So it was in a sense a marginal position, which I would say, however, does not mean that they were indigenous in the modern sense. Indigeneity, that's maybe my provocate thought on it, is a distinctly modern category. So the very idea of indigeneity can only emerge against the backdrop of modernity, coloniality, yeah, modern state, as it means that there's something you have these modern states or modernity has to conceptualize as its other in order to exist. And this is, for instance, the idea of, I don't, yeah, like what people like doing New Order, yeah, this term of masyarakat terasing or whatever, yeah, or like in the colonial era as communities to which adat law applies, yeah. So this is an entirely modern idea, and but that doesn't mean it's simply an invention and it's not real. It's precisely, I would say, politically emancipatory and can be progressive when it embraces this idea that it is born out of modernity as its inherent contradiction. Yeah.
Okay, there's Adriana. Go ahead.
Hello.
Halo, Adriana. Oh,
Adriana,
saya lagi tidak bisa dengar. Saya
yeah,
kenal dia.
do you wanna ask questions?
Yes, it's clear my voice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now we can.
Yeah, I'm Adriana from Kupang, West Timor, East Nusa Tenggara. So I'm glad to hear that because it's talking about the indigenous people, like that. I research about this one, and even I live in Kupang in West Timor, but I came from Sumba. You know about the Sumba, about the social class and slavery from the our our culture. And when you Timo, you talking about the indigenous people, it's reflecting me about my research before about the history of Sumba, especially Mamboro. It's a place in Middle Sumba. So I wanna ask. I'm sorry. I as a curator also. So in my research about the history of Sumba, about the indigenous people, I want to ask about the impact from the colonial and to the indigenous people from us, because the slavery is not our pure culture, because it's impact from the maritime trade for my research, and for give the powerful the for the indigenous people how to make it clear about the social class and the slavery, that not our pure culture. So I'm, the Gen Z about this one to respond, and for to the in metamodernism era, we want to clear it about the it's not uh, the absolute truth. So how about it's our generation to make it clear, because this is not our pure culture, about the impact the economics, politics, and about the trade maritime, the localized in our area in Sumba. I think about that. Maybe you can give us one thing or several things that I and my team or my friends from the Sumba who live in Timor to make it clear. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would always say that it's it's often problematic to if you want to investigate indigeneity as something authentic. I mean, of course, indigeneity often appears as authentic to the people, also to the people who apply it. But it's of course always already something that had become into existence through the exchange with its other. Yeah? It can be trade. It can be like a mutual exchange. It can be also by get into and of course more often through relations of power, yeah, and indigenous peoples being those who were dominated. But this, of course, always means that there's no authentic position. There's no solid ground um, this position can stand on. And that's also the sense what I found when I talked with activists, because they are so different backgrounds. Some of them claim, of course, yeah, there is our tradition and we have to revitalize it. But others are also very aware of that. Yeah, basically, we use the idea of the marginalized to apply different social standards to pursue our aims. Yeah? And especially we have the problem where we have indigenous communities which are so hierarchical, like in Sumba, I would say that's also the case. And I don't know much about Sumba, but I remember when I was the first time in Indonesia in 2009 or so, uh, I was then in Sumba, and we with my group we stayed at a local king, and yeah, and learn a little bit about the social structure in Sumba, and of course it's quite hierarchical, like in Toraja. So it's very easy if you introduce the idea of indigeneity to strengthen and revitalize traditional hierarchies. Yeah. And basically, you going back to a colonial sort of thinking where you have this idea of authentic groups, authentic adult groups who you just have to give their own legal and political space. Yeah. Um, and as I said, against this, the idea of indigeneity as something that is constantly reinvented. And indigeneity is what indigenous people themselves are actively making of it. Of course, against the backdrop of their history and their society, but also emphasizing that indigenous people, not only traditional elites, can be creative. They have also precisely modern ideas of equality, yeah, and economic, gender equality, whatever, yeah, and introduce these as indigenous. Like, for instance, and I haven't talked much about it, but in the Duile communities, so what you have there is still, I mean, there's this idea of a fairly egalitarian indigenous communities because of the Darul Islam history. But in terms of gender, I would say they're more hierarchical than the Toraja. But now some indigenous female activists use the idea of a tradition and gerakan masyarakat adat to introduce opportunities for women to participate in economic processes, which is, of course, if you could argue, not indigenous at all, because it's not the pure tradition, but that's the tradition they want to have. Yeah, so traditions also, can also be a choice of kind. So what you consider worthy of being part of your tradition. Yeah, is it hierarchical or is it egalitarian? And in a Sumba context, I would say that's also very important. Where you have this strong hierarchies. Even though, of course, I'm not an expert of on Sumba, so I don't want to speculate. You are the expert there.
Adriana, do you have another follow-up question?
No, I think enough. I want to get a follow up or closer with the people who want to interesting with the research about the social class or the slavery in Zumba. If you guys interact with this one, I and my team in last year ever get a research about this one about the indigenous people also, so you can read about the history and the culture of the stone and the the life after that. So you guys, if you wanted to close about the indigenous people, I can give that. It's free for you guys to explore that. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Now we'll move on to the next question. It's from Mahtab Hasanzadeh. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Forgive me if this is a silly question. I come from a different academic background in Iranian political and cultural history. Do you think there would exist a concept of indigeneity as potent as it exists today if a society had not been colonized in the manner Indonesia was? I am curious of your use of standpoint theory and wonder how such a framework would operate without the aforementioned complex. Does standpoint require a colonized other?
I would say it, yeah, usually in the case of indigenous peoples, it usually in practice does. I'm thinking of an example where you have indigeneity in a non, but then of course it depends on what you term colonial. So, like in Europe, you have some groups considering themselves indigenous, like Sami in Finland and so on. But I would argue that probably they would say, yeah, still we were colonialized by the Finnish or Swedish state. So at least you need the strong asymmetrical dependencies in every case. And usually in most of the times they come as colonial colonial um, encounters, but I think maybe in Thailand you also have the concept of indigeneity, even though it was not an European colony. Um, but still, they would say, yeah, but we were colonized by the Thai state or by Thai society. The important thing is you have this, you have a dominant social entity, like a colonial state or a nation state, and something that is marginalized. Yeah. And again, many times it's colonial, but not often. Standpoint theory. So yeah, the basic idea of standpoint theory is, and of course you gain specific insight due to your social position. Like if you are a woman, you have special insights into what the patriarchal order is. When you are indigenous, you have special insights into what it means to be marginalized in a state or in a colonial order or whatever. And yeah, I would say this is important for indigeneity as well. But there's one problem I would raise here. It's you could argue that then standpoint theory suggests that your particular standpoint allows you unique insight, and also then normatively you argue for play for a social space outside the existing social order that is oppressing you. Yeah? So then you need this idea of safe space and specific or special social spaces or indigenous territories where you can be fully indigenous or whatever. However, I would say your indigeneity is a progressive force when it goes beyond it and makes claims for the whole society. Yeah? Not only saying, yeah, I need my sovereign space, and then everything can be as it is, but saying, yes, I have a special position, I'm marginalized, and therefore I understand the problems of the whole, of the social totality of society. But my idea now is to change the whole social order. And you were talking about the context of Iran, yeah? just imagine or take as example the women life freedom movement, yeah, which does exactly that. It started as a movement, yeah, because a woman was killed, Kurdish women, which of course was a special, especially marginalized position as a woman and as a Kurd. But then this movement made claims for the whole society, for Iran, that uh, it wasn't saying, okay, then we have to give women a special place, space where they can assert themselves, or we give a special territory for the Kurdish people. No, they said we want to change the whole social order of Iran as a theocracy, which because that particular position of the Kurdish women is the um, position of the, or should be, a position of the universal. So even non-Kurdish male then identified with her. Yeah? And that also you could potentially do with every marginalized political identity. The question is always whether you say standpoint theory just argues that we need our separate social space and every part in society is living side by side. Again, like in the colonial time, like in the colonial era. But then you don't have a society which you can change. Yeah? And indigenous people movements became interesting when they aim at these profound changes. But I'm talking too much. I think there are some more questions. I hope I at least in part answer your question.
No worries, Timo. Your answer really makes everyone wants to ask more and more. um, and then there is another question from Umar. So, since your dialectical framework relies heavily on the interaction between state legal structures and local identity, to what extent is this theory trapped in generalizations that overlook the differences between voluntary indigeneity in relatively stable regions, such as Sulawesi, and existential indigeneity in areas marked by militaristic repression and deep historical trauma, such as Papua or during the conflict period in Aceh?
Yeah. Well, es ist alles you can say, of course, now in Indigeneity, especially in Rekan, it was quite a relatively smooth process of recognition. But don't forget, there were also cultural traumas, yeah, like the Darul Islam and the war between Darul Islam and the Indonesian army. It was a totally violent era where people even didn't have clothes to wear. Yeah, they were deprived of their basic needs and basic things they need for living. They were in constant threat that the Indonesian army would burn their villages because they found people of Islam. So then they didn't even dare to build stable houses because they thought, okay, there might be burned in by next week or so. So that's also something that had a huge impact of these people even today in the Duri area. So yeah, but of course, when you are in places like Aceh or Papua, then you could think, okay, there might then have different concepts of indigeneity. But what was happened in Aceh was they expressed their difference not through indigeneity, but through the idea of Aceh as a special people with special characteristics, which were characterized more and more as religious, especially in after Suharto, that they need this social space to assert themselves. Whereas in Papua, and this is also the problem for the indigenous movement, that they said, oh yeah, we cannot speak on behalf, or we cannot recognize ethnic groups or larger groups. We only deal with komunitas masyarakat adat, because otherwise they would be perceived as a threat to the Indonesian unity. When you say, I don't know, like Papuans are indigenous, then you instantly would get strong reactions from the Indonesian government. Yeah, that you will that you threaten you oppose the idea of the unitary state of Indonesia and so on. Um, so yeah, this concept of not focusing on larger social groups like ethnic groups, but on just communities. And this idea of dialectical relation between state and, I mean, I would argue you're also not an expert on it, but in the Aceh case, don't you have it as well, that the idea of Aceh as a special region in Indonesia, of course, also relies on the state, and the idea of Aceh identity um, came into came also into existence as we have it today through its opposition to the Indonesian state. Yeah? But then they needed the state of Indonesia to negotiate with and also to guarantee Aceh's position as a region with special autonomy, because who gives the autonomy? The state of Indonesia. Yeah? So you make right claims to the state, which you initially reject. And so it's this idea of the indigenous paradox.
Yes, and there's another question. It's from Friendy. Does dialectics explain why recognition politics produce certain outcomes, or does it just name contradictions? Quote unquote, if the state helps produce indigeneity, does indigenous critique of the state still count as indigenous? That's the first question. And then the second one, does recognition strengthen autonomy, or does it increase state control through legibility? Recognition regimes redistribute land and power into governable categories such as criteria, mapped borders, RUU adat, and etc.
Outcome. Well, the idea of dialectics is that it is contradictions that leads to new forms, which are then inherently contradictive. So in the case of adat and masyarakat adat, the idea is that you have two supposedly opposites, state and indigeneity, but also that indigeneity itself is an effect of contradictions within the state and the economy in the first place. Because there is no social totality that is free of contradictions. That is basically what I would say totalitarian approaches always suggest, that there is, or there could be, a social totality in which all contradictions are resolved. But in practice, as soon as you resolve one contradiction, a new one emerge. Like when Indonesia got independent, the contradictions between two legal regimes, European and Adat regimes, were resolved as you had only one Indonesian law as a new unifying system. But then again, new contradictions already emerged, because then the question was, okay, then what is then Indonesia in the first place? Is it something where we can rely on our traditions, or is it something we have to build anew? And then during the new order, the contradiction between this supposedly harmonious developmental state of the new order and, as an economic effect, the dispossession of people and the emergence of a counter movement. So I would say indigenous, if the state has produced indigeneity, does indigenous critique of the state still count indigenous? Yes, of course. I would say it does because indigenous indigenous critique. I would here even distinguish between indigenous criticism and indigenous critique. Indigenous criticism focuses, if you will, on a specific content, like um, the content of indigeneity is that we have our special characteristics, A, B, C, D, blah, blah, blah. We have our indigenous law, blah, blah, blah. And so the content of indigeneity. This is indigenous criticism. And because this is the criticism then is the state does not recognize this specific indigenous content. And indigenous critique, in contrast, does not criticize or does not aim at this content, but at the form, at the structural mechanisms through which this content emerges as indigenous in the first place. So indigenous criticism has as its subjects the structural mechanism of society and state as such, which are inherently contradictory. Yeah? And indigeneity emerges at this very cracks, at this very contradictions within society as such. That means it recognizes its position as part of this social totality of state, of society, of capitalism, but then um, explains how these basic constituents of indigeneity are inherently contradictory. Yeah? And this is, I would say, indigenous critique um, um, opposed to indigenous criticism. And this is indigenous not because it is authentic, pure, yeah, or untouched by modernity, but precisely because it acknowledges modernity as something that brought it into existence, and therefore becoming able to see the fundamental contradictions of modernity or capitalism or state as such. And the second question, does recognition strengthen autonomy or does it increase state control through? Okay, I would say, yeah, paradoxically, it does both. Yeah, it on the one hand, we like in at least in my case studies, this recognition led to certain um, fields of autonomy where where indigenous people now can have like land, yeah, indigenous forests they are in charge of, which is of course an increase in autonomy. However, since they do it as part of environmental local discourses on development, they are also part of the state, and the state is, in a sense, reproduced. The state is not only state institution, state, I mean, also discourses, yeah, the way to improve, as Tanya Lee puts it, the idea of entrepreneurial capitalism, yeah, carried out through local communities. That's also the state. So it reproduces state and simultaneously also achieve certain degrees of autonomy where it can contradict um, these approaches. For instance, by now introducing the idea of communal ownership of means of production. Yeah.
All right.
Well,
Thank
I would say both. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Timo. And I think this should be our last question from the audience because it's almost 6 p.m. here. Subandri Simbolon.
Iya, Mbak.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'm the last question. Okay. Uh, Thank you, Timo. This really was the outstanding conversations. To make short, uh, I want to ask related to was the religiosity of adat people or indigenous, as we can say that. Uh, I didn't listen yet. You mentioned about the secularization of adat because that's one of the biggest agenda of colonial at the time, and also even in Indonesian government now that seeing indigenous is a secular as was the community, even though they have really deep in their own religiosity as themselves. So I just questioning, based on your research, do indigenous activities use this discourse, religiosity of indigenous, towards that to gain the rights from the government, and how this discourse also can be fruitful in their movement, uh, as we know that Indonesian really concerned about religious as a religious country, right? For
Yeah.
example, when the indigenous use their own religiosity to say that our land is our worship place. So can we use that? Can to what extent that this discourse can indigenous use towards that to protect the land, for example, in your research? So this focus on related to indigenous and their own religiosity. Is that makes sense? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Supan. I would like to answer in two ways. First, if you look at the local example of Enrekang, as I
Mm,
previously talked a little bit about it, um, the problem was there that masyarakat adat was perceived as a threat to proper religiosity, just to Islam as one of the acknowledged, officially acknowledged religions in Indonesia. Yeah? So, because in
yeah.
Indonesia, I would say it's religiously it's pluralistic, but it's a limited pluralism, and it's also and the religious pluralism in Indonesia is always in that sense bureaucratized, that it needs that it relies on this idea of formalized religion. So when you are Muslim, you are Sunni a Muslim, not a Shia over there. Yeah, so this is this mainstream idea, and of course in South Sulawesi especially, this is very important because, as I said, it was an area occupied by the Darul Islam movement, and modernist Islam always had been strong. Muhammadiyah is really strong in Rekang. So when this
Mm,
idea emerges that indigenous recognition might come at the expense of proper religiosity, that is of Islam, and revitalize traditional beliefs, of course, then people will reject it because it's seen as a threat to proper religiosity. And
yeah.
in Reka, they solved this problem by or through institutional activism. So activists were active, especially in the PAN party, the Partai Amanat Nasional, yeah, which is also a
Mm,
religious modernist Islamic party.
yeah.
And in negotiations between 2016 and 2019, sorry, before 2016, especially 2015, 2016, they managed to pursue religious um, politicians in America that the recognition of indigenous community does not mean revitalization of the traditional religion Aluk Tujolo in Toraja. Yeah? And only then
Mm,
the Berda could pass. And a similar process you can observe also on the national scale, where there was this debate between people who argued that kepercayaan or traditional beliefs should be
yeah.
acknowledged in Indonesia. And then you had basically a split in, I would say, a traditionalist, a traditional nationalist camp, yeah, who argued,
Mm,
of course, these religions are super Indonesian because they have been here even before Islam, even before Hinduism and Buddhism came to Indonesia. So we must acknowledge them as generally Indonesian. And
yeah.
religious Muslim politicians who said no, because it's not in accordance to the idea of Ketuhanan Yang Maha Esa, because these traditional kepercayaan, they don't have this concept of Ketuhanan Yang Maha Esa, and therefore it's not suitable for Indonesia. And what Aman did when this debate emerged some years ago, it, at least what I observed, they were pretty saying nothing about it. Because on the one hand, there are people in Amman who were, of course, sympathetic with the idea of the acknowledgement of indigenous religions, because that would be something that could distinguish themselves as indigenous and as different from the mainstream society, and also, and that's also a problem, different from the state who have this idea of Ketuhanan Yang Maha Esa. But Amman kept silent because they knew quite well that this would make it even harder for institutional activism to argue for the acknowledgement of indigenous communities, because then all the pious politicians would be highly skeptic. Oh, say, oh no, that will come at the expense of Islam, so we should not do it. Yeah, so I would say usually that's in almost all countries, that's an important aspect of indigeneity, that they have different worldviews, which includes religion, but not so much in Indonesia. Of course, there are indigenous religions, but it's precisely not used as a means to strengthen the difference from state and mainstream society.
Yeah, got it. Thank you, Timo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Timo, for the answer, for answering all the questions here. I know that some of your questions might not been answered yet because due to time limit, but yeah, I hope that you can always be in touch and ask questions to maybe to Timo, and or maybe like contact him through if Timo agrees. Maybe is there any way to contact you to ask questions?
Sure. Yeah, you can also contact me like my email. I write it in the chat. If there are any questions left, please feel free to contact me. Send an email to tduile@uni-bonn.de.
All right. Yes, that's Timo's email already written in the chat. So thank you so much, Timo, for your talks, for the discussions and insights about the indigeneity. And I actually in the process of learning the whole about the indigeneity, basically for my research. So this is a really, really important session for me, and I believe it's also important session for all of you. Thank you so much, Timo, for the time.
Again, for inviting me. I feel very honored, and I wish you all the best. Thanks for your patience and for your attention today. Yeah, and
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
yeah.